Okay, mom's recording now, guys.
Who wants to start? Are we just...
I'll just start. I'm Sarah.
I'm Holly.
I'm Catherine.
And I'm Brooke Avery.
Awesome. So for the lesson 7 case study questions, we're going to go ahead and answer those. And the first one is the general assessment issues. What legal decisions and or classroom decisions were made in the case regarding Esther? So it sounds like she had to go through the typical screening process, which is part of IEPs. And those are all delegated by IDA laws. It also, of course, took a teacher who was observant in her classroom to have her referred to that process. Do we have any other input on that one?
And, what was it? Ellen, I'm not sure who, Ellen, the school psychologist, immediately called an IEP meeting. She didn't wait, she knew
Right.
it was important, so immediately called and they determined what her eligibility was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And question 2, what procedures illustrated best practice? What procedures illustrated less than best practice?
I thought that the response to intervention was probably the best practice. They gave Esther a guide, a bilingual guide that worked with her 4 days a week, and she had other aides.
Yeah.
And so that led the teacher to observe and see she needs more assistance. This isn't working.
Right. I think the part that was less than best practice was maybe the letter that the mom received. It was kind of maybe a surprise a little bit that they were already going that direction where maybe, or hopefully it just didn't mention in this case where the teacher had been, gradually talking through her, like from the time that she was enrolled, like as soon as there was some initial concerns, like communicating directly, so it wasn't such a surprise, that it wasn't unusual, because that's one of the words that was used in this case, that the mom knew it was unusual.
Yeah.
Tight. Mm-hmm. All right. And question 3, was the assessment consistent with appropriate ethical conduct expected from the professionals? What are our thoughts on that?
I would say yes, it was. It seemed like it was in line, like they followed all the right steps, and they had like the psychologist and the special education teacher and the general teacher and parents involved, and the parents can sign the consent form, and so I feel like it was ethical all the way through.
I'm going to agree, because you can tell that there was genuine concern and consideration for all of the circumstances, that they weren't just immediately labeling Esther as, a disabled child because she couldn't speak, but they were really looking at her history and, trying to look at her as a whole person, which I would expect from professionals.
Yeah, and they made sure that they had a whole IEP team. Like, everything was done to get her to, like, meet with the parents. And there's a lot of people in their team, and they went over certain things that, the other school did in the past and stuff, so.
Right. All right.
Test interpretation issues. Question 1. Is it acceptable practice to administer formal assessments, for example, the WISC 3, or to a child who has been in the United States for 1 year and who did not attend school in Mexico? Why or why not?
When you read that question, it's like, yikes, like what did they expect to happen?
Yeah, it's kind of like, what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah.
Like, if they're here, then this is what we do.
Right.
And if you want them to get into schools, you have to do something, so might as well follow the normal procedure. But obviously there can be some maybe exceptions or differentiated, I don't know.
I wonder if that type of test could be given orally in her native language.
Yeah.
If that would have made it more ethical and given a better representation of, her
intelligence, yeah, and her standing.
Yeah, but I definitely think that the test is still needed. But like, yeah, if we could do it in a way that's easier, then that would be obviously the right route. Don't give it to her in a language she knows nothing.
Right. I agree that it's not that it's unethical. It would only be unethical if that was their only method. If that was it and it was just one, standardized test in English, then no, of course it's not ethical. Not that it's causing her harm, but it's not giving a full picture.
I'm pretty sure those tests do come in Spanish, though.
Right now, I'm on.
I think it mentioned that there was a bilingual
right. Did
to help her with the test. Question 2. Results biased by Esther's cultural background and or original language. How do you know?
The first thing that comes to my mind is no, because like it was mentioned earlier, they didn't just say, oh, you're from Mexico, so you're going in a special ed class, or oh, you're brown. It didn't seem like it was discrimination like that. Like they took into account, oh, they looked at her background. She was an orphanage and then adopted and then came here. And I just think it's how they would have treated any other special ed student. And they took the time to actually test like her math, reading, spelling, all of those things. They didn't just say, oh, you seem really dumb, so here you go. It just seemed like they followed the steps and like they cared about her. So I would say that no, it wasn't a cultural bias.
I wonder, I agree that they're not biasing against her because of her culture, but I wonder the test itself, like if it's, asking questions about reading comprehension that are more typical to our culture, then like we've talked about in the textbook, then it's not always fair to students who don't come from this culture. Stories that more represent closer to them, they have an easier time understanding. So I guess I can't say for sure until I've seen the test,
Yeah.
If it's talking about football and it's talking about, things that are more familiar to white kids, then it could be biased in that way.
Yeah, because the questions about the assessments, because I thought it could be about people too, but
right.
Yeah, if the assessments are like, already standardized and whatever, then that probably could be biased towards someone who just came from another country.
Definitely.
The question is, how do we know? And I guess,
I don't know.
very limited case, we don't know for sure yet.
Yeah,
I'd have to see the test. I'd have to see how it was administered, if they gave her enough time, if she was comfortable, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Question 3. Based on the assessment information, describe Esther's current level of functioning.
So I'm going to open up the test scores because, it was
very low.
It's
very
less than 1%.
Yeah.
But Catherine, I like what you said earlier before we started recording that, it's because she grew up with no instruction and what we can infer probably no stimulation in her early childhood. This really isn't a measure of her abilities. It's a measure of, her life experience, which unfortunately was so deprived in her early critical years. So, like it really can't get much lower is what it looks like, which is, more than a red flag. It's like a flaming flag.
It's pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
But it does like.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it does. I mean, not based because the question says based on the assessment information, but it also does talk about how like what you were talking about before, it has like she can do things like house things and stuff like that. So she's not completely, you know.
So what you just said, Brooke, is the evidence of like the skills that were nurtured or, kind of nurtured or reinforced in her childhood. She knows how to take care of herself because she grew up in an orphanage where she didn't have a lot of nurturing. And so those skills she, had to learn to survive, whereas the other skills just weren't fostered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Educational skills.
Yeah.
Question 4. Does Esther have the disability of mental impairment? If so, what evidence supports this conclusion? If not, why not? I would think that maybe to determine if she has a mental impairment, it would have to be a little bit later.
Yeah.
She's received some support. Maybe she's become more fluent in English or able to understand also Spanish as well. Because I think at this point she just doesn't know a lot of English, and we're not able to tell.
Right. I think like at this point, if I had to answer, I'd say yes. And not that can't change, because there's a lot of plasticity in the brain. And so with intervention and with, services coming from multiple sources, then absolutely that could change. And, she could just be on par with her peers, maybe just a few years down the road. It just is too early to tell. So for the time being, I'm going to say yes. And that's not, her fault. It's definitely a result of her, her environment growing up. Most likely, I would assume. I mean, it's possible that that, could have happened regardless, but we just don't know. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. I agree with that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so now on to other assessment issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's me. Describe what you know about Esther's original culture and language background. Well, we know she's from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And she's from an
yes, very little schooling.
Yeah, very little. She obviously, her native language is Spanish, but even in Spanish, she has poor verbal communication skills, and she couldn't read in Spanish either. So it wasn't just English that's been hard for her.
So that leads me to think that, she really was probably severely neglected as a kid. That she just probably wasn't looked at or spoken to. And so, that the language development in those early years was just not, stimulated or fostered in any way. Sadly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That kind of leads us into the second question. Describe what you know about Esther's assimilation into her adopted culture and language.
So she was changed from her home into an orphanage, and that's kind of an adoption in and of itself, because she wasn't home with her birth mother anymore. She lived with her birth mother until she was 7, and then was put in an orphanage, so that was a change for her. And then she was adopted from the orphanage by her adopted parents and brought to the States. So I guess just describe that process. I'm sure that was really hard for Esther, and I'm sure she was stretched a lot just in the orphanage to be able to speak more and communicate better. And I'm sure that was really hard for her.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Okay, number 3. How does Esther's regular education 3rd grade teacher feel about teaching Esther, and why?
Yes, the book.
I know she was frustrated, and partially because she wasn't able to spend one-on-one time alone with her, give her the time she needed to teach her.
Right. And I want to add that I feel her feelings are completely justified. She clearly knows that she's not meeting Esther's needs. That she, it was probably obvious from day one or day two that there was going to be, a lot of extra supports needed for her. And so I don't think it's, her feelings are negative in that, like, why do I have to do this? It's like, I can't do this on my own.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
And she was saying how she lacked like materials and stuff, and she was even saying like even the aide, who was probably at first just like a interpreter kind of aide, said I think she might actually have like learning disabilities. So it wasn't just like, at first, we talked about this a little bit, but at first they didn't just deem her as, she needs special education or whatever. It was until that aide was like, I think she might actually have learning disabilities.
Yeah.
And so I think that's when it was like, okay, she doesn't know English really. So it's hard for that teacher to even be, teaching with her, period, with that aspect. But then on top of it, she has those learning disabilities. And that aide isn't necessarily certified to do that. So
Exactly. Yeah. She's speaking from just, simple observations. So
yeah,
I was happy to see that the psychologist was, called in to do more in-depth assessments so you could get a better handle on the scope of the problem.
Yeah.
Perfect. So it says under activity, you are magically transported to the country of Ukraine, where the spoken and written language is Russian. You cannot understand anyone around you and cannot read the Cyrillic alphabet. Describe the difficulties you might experience in daily living, work, transportation, and meeting other people. Describe possible bias if you were administered an academic achievement test in Ukraine.
Sorry, guys, my daughter just ran in from the bus stop. I'm not sure. I think she needed to go to the bathroom.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just start by saying if I was administered an academic achievement test in Ukraine and it was in Russian, I would do really poorly because I don't know any Russian and I can't read the alphabet. And not only those, like, I guess, obvious things, but also how scared I would be being in a new country with so many people. I would be so stressed. And so it's not just your mental capacity, but also it's like very emotional and I guess even physical too. Like you're eating different food. It's a different, like the, climate and everything. So when you just completely change a child's entire life like that, of course, they're not going to perform their best and probably even perform their worst,
Yeah.
Well, the thing with the Cyrillic alphabet is you can't, as an English-speaking person, you wouldn't be able to pick out any words of what they might be. So
exactly,
completely foreign. Whereas in maybe an adult, maybe some with Spanish, you might be able to pick out a few words and be like, oh, this word means that.
Yeah.
And being able to know the words at all.
Very true.
Right.
Especially if, obviously we're not little kids, but especially I think of like Esther or other little kids that come here from, their other countries. And at that age, like you hardly know your own language and you're still learning how to do things in your own language, and then to come to a country where it's just completely opposite and nothing is the same, that's like impossible. Like,
Yeah.
that would be so hard. That's why I do think like there would need to be some kind of mercy rule almost, where it's like, hey, this girl knows nothing in our language, like we need to give her the same assessment in her language or whatever.
Definitely.
And I really wonder what supports would be set up in Russia for that type of thing. I mean, I know that there's a lot of people who do speak Ukrainian and Russian, just like there's a lot of people here in America that also speak Spanish.
Yeah.
But they might have their own biases against Ukrainians, like that whole part of
Yeah.
the world, they already are kind of upset at each other. And
Yeah.
when I lived in Spokane, there was a huge Russian and Ukrainian population. When the one little scuffle broke out, there was full on fistfights at the little Russian market. It was really they're fierce in their loyalties, and so I think it's everything that we've already talked about, plus like just contention too. I can't even imagine, like trying to get to work or trying to
Yeah.
read any type of sign, like even to take the bus. I would have no idea what I was doing.
Yeah, and you'd have trouble ordering food or buying food or like knowing what to cook in that country because it's different food, and you would just, like you said, have trouble even like landing a job probably just because you don't
For
speak the
real.
language, so it'd be really hard to find employment.
And something I thought when you mentioned the signs is, they might have a visual picture. They might have a picture, which I know is a good tool for people who are in the American school system, maybe ELLs, who are learning the language, and visuals are big helps to them being able to pick out, oh, this is what that is,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Agreed. Yeah, if you can go off live. I'm so sorry. My little daughter, she didn't get on the bus. She's
Okay.
in the bathroom.